What happens when the ticking clock of political transition meets the ultimate question of life and death? Right now, 40 lives hang in the balance as Catholic groups make an urgent plea to President Biden. With Donald Trump's return to office on the horizon, these death row inmates face an uncertain future that could drastically change with the stroke of a pen. The Catholic Mobilizing Network has launched a desperate campaign, calling on Biden to use his remaining time in office to commute these death sentences. But with Trump's strong support for capital punishment looming ahead, will these 11th-hour efforts be enough? And what does this moment tell us about the complex intersection of faith, justice, and political power in America? To understand the gravity of this moment, we need to look at President Biden's complicated journey with capital punishment. Back in 1994, as a senator, Biden played a pivotal role in expanding the federal death penalty. His support helped create legislation that added 60 new federal crimes punishable by death, a stark contrast to his current position. But times and perspectives change. After nearly 3 decades, Biden made history as the first presidential candidate to campaign on a platform explicitly calling for the abolition of the federal death penalty. This remarkable shift reflects a broader evolution in American attitudes toward capital punishment. Yet the path between these two positions hasn't been straightforward. While Biden's personal views have transformed, his administration has sent mixed signals. They've maintained a moratorium on federal executions, yes, but they've also continued to pursue death sentences in several high-profile cases. This paradox raises questions about the true depth of Biden's commitment to ending capital punishment. Now, as his presidency enters its final chapter, Biden faces a crucial decision. Will he use his executive power to permanently spare these 40 lives? Or will his complex history with the death penalty continue to influence his actions? The clock is ticking, and the stakes couldn't be higher. When Donald Trump took office in 2017, the federal death chamber had been silent for nearly 2 decades. But in July 2019, everything changed. Attorney General William Barr announced the Department of Justice would resume federal executions, setting in motion one of the most aggressive execution sprees in American history. What followed was unprecedented in modern times. In just 6 months, from July 2020 to January 2021, 13 federal inmates were put to death. The pace was staggering, averaging 1 execution every 2 weeks during the final months of Trump's presidency. Think about that for a moment. After 17 years without a single federal execution, suddenly the machinery of death was operating at full capacity. Among these executions was one that particularly captured the nation's attention: the case of Lisa Montgomery. Her death marked the first time in nearly 70 years that a woman had been executed by the federal government. Montgomery's case highlighted the complex intersection of severe mental illness, trauma, and criminal justice. She was convicted of a horrific crime: the murder of a pregnant woman and the theft of her unborn child. But her execution also raised serious questions about how our justice system handles cases involving severe mental illness and profound childhood trauma. The Trump administration's aggressive pursuit of executions broke with both recent precedent and international trends. While most developed nations and many U.S. states were moving away from capital punishment, the federal government was racing to carry out as many executions as possible before the change in administration. This surge of executions occurred despite numerous legal challenges, concerns about COVID-19 spread in prisons, and passionate pleas from human rights organizations and religious leaders. The impact of this period continues to reverberate through our justice system. It demonstrated how quickly federal death penalty policy can change with new leadership, and raised urgent questions about the role of executive power in matters of life and death. As we look ahead to another potential Trump presidency, these 13 executions serve as a stark reminder of what could be at stake. The Catholic Church's position on capital punishment has evolved significantly over the years, culminating in what many consider its strongest stance yet. The Church now declares the death penalty inadmissible, not just wrong or problematic, but fundamentally incompatible with Catholic teaching on human dignity and the sanctity of life. This isn't merely a suggestion. It's now enshrined in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the official doctrine that guides 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. This stance has taken on new urgency with the Catholic Mobilizing Network's current campaign. They're not just advocating for abstract policy change, They're racing against time, pushing President Biden to commute all 40 federal death row sentences before potentially losing this window of opportunity. Think about that number for a moment. 40 individuals whose lives hang in the balance. 40 families waiting to see if mercy will prevail over retribution. The timing of this push is particularly significant, coinciding with the upcoming Jubilee year in 2025, a time the Catholic Church designates for mercy and reconciliation. The symbolism couldn't be more powerful. What better way to mark a year of mercy than by sparing 40 lives? But this isn't just about religious symbolism. The Catholic Mobilizing Network argues that the death penalty is a broken system that fails to deter crime or make communities safer. This campaign puts President Biden, only the second Catholic president in U.S. history, in a unique position. He's being called upon not just as a political leader, but as a man of faith, to act on principles that his church holds as fundamental truths about human dignity and redemption. The question becomes, will he heed this call from his faith community, or will political considerations prevail? Now, here's where things get really interesting in Biden's presidency. We're looking at what appears to be a striking contradiction between words and actions. While Biden made history as the first presidential candidate to openly campaign for abolishing the federal death penalty, his administration's actual track record tells a more complex story. Consider the Department of Justice's approach under Biden's leadership. Yes, Attorney General Merrick Garland did impose a moratorium on federal executions, a move that seemed to align perfectly with Biden's campaign promises. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find some puzzling inconsistencies that raise serious questions about the administration's true stance. Take the case of the Boston Marathon bomber, for instance. Despite having the power to drop the death penalty pursuit, the Biden administration has actively fought to keep capital punishment on the table. Then there's the Tree of Life synagogue shooter, who received a death sentence in 2023 with the full backing of Biden's Justice Department. And let's not forget about the Buffalo grocery store shooting case. The administration is still actively seeking the death penalty for Peyton Gendron, who killed nearly a dozen black shoppers. These high-profile cases force us to grapple with some difficult questions. How do we reconcile Biden's public opposition to capital punishment with his administration's continued pursuit of death sentences? Is there a meaningful distinction between halting new executions and maintaining existing death sentences? Or are we witnessing the age-old tension between campaign promises and the complex realities of governing? And perhaps most crucially, what message does this send to the 40 individuals currently on federal death row? They sit in their cells, their futures hanging in the balance, watching an administration that claims to oppose their punishment while simultaneously seeking it for others. The clock is ticking, and with Trump's potential return to office looming, these contradictions take on an even more urgent significance. The landscape of death penalty legislation has seen significant movement in recent years, though success in actually changing federal law has remained elusive. In 2021, we saw a bold attempt to address this issue head-on when Democratic senators introduced the Federal Death Penalty Prohibition Act. Despite its promising start, the bill met the fate of many reform efforts before it, dying in committee without reaching a full vote. Undeterred, these same lawmakers have brought the legislation back in the current congressional session. But here's the critical question. With time running out and political divisions deepening, what are the realistic chances of passing such sweeping reform? The stakes couldn't be higher, especially with Trump's potential return to the White House drawing closer. Let's remember what happened during Trump's first term. 13 federal executions in just 6 months. That's more than any administration had carried out in decades. Now, with 40 lives hanging in the balance on federal death row, the consequences of inaction become starkly clear. These aren't just statistics. These are human lives caught in a political pendulum swing that could determine whether they live or die. Think about the precedent this sets for our justice system. Every 4 to 8 years, we could see dramatic shifts in how we approach capital punishment, creating a justice system that operates not on consistent principles, but on political whims. The window for action is closing, and the consequences of letting it shut without taking decisive action could be irreversible for those on death row. For those who oppose capital punishment, the urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. The coming months may represent the last chance to prevent a return to the aggressive execution policies we witnessed during Trump's first term. Will this reality be enough to break through the legislative gridlock that has stalled so many reform efforts? Or are we destined to repeat the cycle of political shifts that has characterized our nation's complex relationship with capital punishment? As we reflect on this pivotal moment in our nation's history, I can't help but wonder, what does it say about us as a society when our approach to life and death can shift so dramatically with each new administration? The moral weight of these decisions affects not just the 40 individuals currently on federal death row, but speaks to the very core of who we are as a nation. Think about this. In a country founded on the principles of justice and human dignity, how do we reconcile these values with a system that can execute 13 people in 6 months under one president, then grind to a halt under another? What message does this send about the consistency and fairness of our justice system? The clock is ticking, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Will President Biden seize this moment to make a definitive statement about the value of human life, even those lives we find most difficult to defend? Or will we continue this cyclical pattern where justice becomes a matter of political timing? I want to hear your thoughts on this. What do you believe is the right path forward? Should we continue with a system where the fate of death row inmates depends on who occupies the White House? Or is it time for a more permanent solution? Share your perspective in the comments below, and let's keep this crucial conversation going. Remember to join us tomorrow for another deep dive into the stories that shape our criminal justice system. Until then, this is Sean Dupree reminding you that every case we cover isn't just a story, it's about real lives hanging in the balance. Hey listeners, welcome back to the Real Crime Diary. I'm your host, Sean Dupree. If you tuned in last time, we had a deep dive into the disturbing history of power abuse across different eras, looking at the connection between dominance, control, and how it plays out even today. We touched on scandals from the past and compared them with some modern-day examples, showing how these patterns of abuse, unfortunately, persist. One of the most insightful tools we've explored to understand this is my book, Power, Pleasure, and Pain, a study of abuse through time. It's not just a historical account, but an interdisciplinary approach to understanding why this keeps happening. We draw from history, philosophy, and modern case studies to explain how figures like Dominique Pellico, Harvey Weinstein, and others have exploited their positions of power for their own gain, often protected by the very systems meant to stop them. Recap of last interaction. In our last live stream, we discussed how libertinism, philosophically introduced by figures like Marquis de Sade, has shaped the way power and pleasure have been entangled throughout history. This concept ties directly into how figures like Weinstein operated, as we saw parallels between de Sade's fictional characters and the way powerful men manipulated their victims in real life. You guys had some amazing comments, asking how societal structures have allowed these behaviors to go unchecked for so long. It's a crucial question, and one that the book addresses deeply. Why this book is valuable. Now, what's powerful about Power, Pleasure, and Pain is its ability to break down these historical patterns and link them to the present. You're not just reading about ancient Rome or Enlightenment philosophy, you're seeing how these ideologies are alive today. The book uncovers how sexual violence and control have been systematically woven into the fabric of societies from ancient times right up to the modern era. It's about understanding not just the individual predators, but the systems that protect them, whether it's in royal courts, religious institutions, or today's corporate and entertainment worlds. Through these historical lenses, we also explore movements like #MeToo that are beginning to dismantle these structures. The fight for justice is far from over, but as the book demonstrates, we are in the midst of a cultural shift where legal reforms are finally addressing these long-standing issues. It's more than a history lesson. It's a guide to understanding and supporting change today. What's next? If you want to dive deeper, I suggest picking up Power, Pleasure, and Pain, a study of abuse through time. It's available now, and trust me, it will change the way you think about power, pleasure, and control. We've even got some exclusive content coming up on the channel where we'll be exploring the book's case studies in even more detail, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to The Real Crime Diary so you don't miss any updates. Let's keep this conversation going. because understanding the past is key to changing the future.